to be perfectly honest, hypnotherapy is wonderfully powerful, but it is not yet regulated. And the education is not where it needs to be at all.
And that's what I was reacting to, is that there's a lot of people out there who are touting it. I don't know what it is they're doing, but they're also not always informed as to other things like around psychodiagnosis and other comorbid conditions. Then they may end up steering back into a traditional therapist's office. And, and that could happen with anybody, like, in any unregulated discipline.
Yes.
But in the same breath, if you look at the empirical research, the research on hypnotherapy and smoking is incontrovertible, and that's the recommendation I will always make to a client who's struggling with quitting smoking: hypnotherapy first.
Really?
Yes, because it's where the evidence. See, I'm an evidence-based kind of gal.
Yes, I know.
You know that about me. So from that place, I was like, it's a no-brainer. Like, this is non-invasive. They're not putting more, nicotine and stuff in their body with gums and all that. They can actually, and it works. I mean, and there's a good research base for that. But even, to your point, Grace, which is so interesting, you say, we think of hypnotherapy, we think of watches going back and forth and all that. Let's go back to the very beginning. Like him or not, Freud changed this field. He made this field, whether we want to own that or not. It's like two people in a room and something happens. But what was he doing? He was people were getting into such a relaxed state that they started to talk. And so when you think of where Freud's practice began, sort of the release of what we call more now somatic conditions, but he used to call it hysteria. People who would claim they were paralyzed in their foot, or they were frozen, or they were hysterically blind. They weren't blind, they could see. And when you look at Freud's early writings and all of his early case studies, it was the relaxation the client was put in, talk, and then the release. And I'm still convinced it wasn't the early childhood work they were doing, the early conflicts. It was the relaxation, talk. And that's what was releasing the symptomatology.
What I'm hearing is that the advent of what we now know as therapy and psychology had influence of what we now know as hypnotherapy.
100 years ago. 100 years ago. Yeah. That's really where it all began, because Freud's mentor was a guy named Charcot. And even before Charcot was a guy named Mesmer, mesmerized. It all came from that name. That Mesmer and Charcot were hypnotherapists.
Wow.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, that was his original training.
Grace, when people hear about hypnotherapy and they say, no thank you, I'll take some crystals to go as well. No, I'm not doing any of that stuff. It's nonsense, it doesn't work. What do you say to them?
I say, well, here's the thing, and this is what I tell my students, because we actually created our own certification school for hypnotherapy to make sure that we do up the standards for practicing members of this field. And I say to my students, we're not evangelists, okay? It's not our job to go out and convert people into people who want to do hypnotherapy. It is our job to show up and be as professional as possible and help people who are seeking help. And because people come to hypnosis as a last resort, they eventually find us if something else didn't work along the way. But there's also so much wonderful research coming out. So, for example, there was a study from Stanford that found that women with metastatic breast cancer, the group that did hypnotherapy had 50% less pain during their treatment than the control group. But at a 10-year follow-up of the same group of women, those who had done hypnotherapy had twice the survival rate. And this is out of Stanford. And another study from Harvard Medical School showed that those who did hypnotherapy as compared to the control group, when they had an ankle fracture, at 6.5 weeks, they were showing 8.5 weeks of healing. So bones were healing 40% faster.
But were they doing hypnotherapy for that specific thing?
Visualizing the healing of their ankle fracture.
Okay.
40% faster. And there's just so many studies, there's no convincing. You either want to do it, and you look at the empirical data of this is absolutely effective and can help you, or you don't. And if you don't, there's no convincing you, and that's not my job.
Right. Now, that makes a lot of logical sense to me. As a doctor and as a psychology expert, how do you respond to that?
So I think that, in some ways it completely is in line with any of us who do health behavior change research, right? So it's unearthing that back story, which is such a part of most therapists. I say most because the behaviorists are just going to take it straight up without the historical piece. But for the rest of us, we do dig deep and look at the meanings of things. So that's what this feels like to me. Just it's a different kind of a frame than I think we would call it, that those of us who do more sort of traditional talk therapies, as it were, that it is that we may not call it going into the subconscious, but I view all therapists of every stripe to really be archaeologists.
Yes.
Here's your psyche, and
Yes.
let's start digging. And then before you know it, we get to the pottery shards and we get to all this other stuff and we lay it out and I'm like, what is this?
Yes.
And then we start putting it together. Oh, it's an old ancient dish.
Right.
And in your case, it's your ancient hurt.